ASRock X570 Creator is designed to be functional and offer performance without any of the usual aesthetic elements that are found on gaming branded motherboards. The design of this motherboard is pretty simple, with a black and silver color combination and dark blue accents applied directly on the PCB surface. The heatsinks also share the graphic elements found on the PCB, with lines engraved into the metallic surface. As is the case with most, if not all, X570 chipset motherboards, the chipset heatsink also has a small fan for active cooling, which of course is loud, as most of these fans are. But more on that later on. The price of the ASRock X570 Creator is around $500 or 499 euros. Quite a lot to pay for just a motherboard. But by the end of this review, we will figure out if this particular model is actually worth the hefty price tag we are asked to pay. Before we move into the main features of the X570 Creator and its performance, we have to look into what comes with this expensive motherboard, and thus opening the packaging. Starting with the basics, included we have the user manual and a quick start guide. These contain all the required information regarding the motherboard, especially all the pin layouts and the BIOS settings, so make sure to keep those around. Next, the always present DVD with the drivers and the usual case badge. The I/O shield is thankfully padded and has the same design as the motherboard. There are also two M.2 SSD screws and standoffs included in their own little bags. For connectivity, there are also 4 all-black SATA cables with standard connectors. Some right-angle connectors would have been nice, and this is where things get really serious, as included we have a right-angled mini DisplayPort to DisplayPort cable, or adapter, how we want to say it. However, it is quite a unique item. The last two accessories are the base of the Wi-Fi antenna and the antenna itself. Finally, the motherboard is well protected in its packaging by a high-quality soft foam frame that protects the sides and the back of the motherboard. The X570 Creator has a total of 14 phases for the VRM, running in a 12+2 configuration. 12 phases for the CPU and 2 phases for the memory. The Mosfets featured on this VRM are the Infineon IR3555 model. These are used for both the low side and the high side of the VRM. The voltage controller is an Infineon IR35201. In terms of capacitors, those used are part of the 12K Black series from Nichicon. After looking at all of these components, I can safely say that this is a very good VRM, and it is what we would expect to find on a high-end motherboard such as this one. There should be no problems pushing the overclocking on a Ryzen CPU with this VRM. One difference between the X570 Creator and other high-end motherboards is the usage of a 10GB Acacia AQC107 network controller, which is being passively cooled by its own little heatsink, which is nice. You also have to understand that the Acacia AQC107 is expensive, in the range of $80 to $100 for the same network controller placed on a dedicated PCIe adapter to use with your motherboard. In the case of the Creator, it is directly integrated into the motherboard and has full support with other components. Next to the Acacia AQC107 network controller, there is a single DisplayPort input connector. This connector is meant to be used with the included cable for Thunderbolt 3 connectivity. To help with this function, some of ASRock's graphics cards feature a mini Thunderbolt connector on the side of the PCB. Now we can go through the features of this motherboard, starting with the fast storage. There are only 2 Hyper M.2 sockets available. Thankfully, both are cooled passively by heatsinks. And here is where the first problem is. The bottom M.2 socket has its heatsink integrated into the chipset heatsink. This means that in order to access the M.2 SSD, you need to remove the chipset heatsink. Well, sort of. ASRock figured out a way to solve this issue by making the chipset heatsink a 2-part component. A clever solution to a problem that shouldn't have existed in the first place, but we take what we can get. The regular storage is composed out of 8 SATA 6 ports, all right-angled for better cable management. 4 of these ports are controlled by the ASMedia ASM1061 chip found on the left side of the BIOS battery, dead center into the motherboard. Speaking of the BIOS, this motherboard, while being a high-end model aimed at productivity, has only a single BIOS chip installed. At this price point, 2 BIOS chips would have been nice to see, especially when corruption of these BIOSes can be very easily done by improper updating. Thankfully, this problem can be avoided as ASRock installed a BIOS Flashback button located at the top of the I/O panel of the motherboard. By using this function, the BIOS can be overridden, and thus you can save the motherboard even if a BIOS update has failed and the BIOS itself is corrupted. As is the case with many high-end motherboards, the ASRock X570 Creator uses metal reinforced Pci Express Slots. The reinforcement of these slots is done to prevent any type of damage or bending to the pins caused by a graphics card that is either too heavy, not secured properly to the chassis, or when the system is being moved. There is also a design choice with these slots as they improve the overall look of the motherboard. Like most, if not all X570 chipset equipped motherboards, the X570 Creator model uses both passive and active cooling for the chipset. The active cooling is done by a 36mm fan manufactured by Everflow with the model number T124010SL. Fortunately, this fan can be controlled through the BIOS of the motherboard and ASRock's own software. However, from the factory, it is configured using an aggressive fan profile that makes it spin too fast for an idling system. On the lower edge of the motherboard, there are some features that should be mandatory for any motherboard that has a retail price of over $90 without any questions asked. I am talking of course about the 2-digit display, a display that will show you error codes for problem diagnostics, but which can also be configured to show real-time CPU temperature. Next to the display, there are the power and reset buttons, which are also illuminated of course, and above them you can see a small BIOS reset switch. The X570 Creator features two internal USB 3.0 headers which are placed in different locations for your convenience and to aid with the cable management. The first header is found under the 24-pin ATX connector, while the second header is placed on the lower edge of the motherboard. Unfortunately, neither of these USB 3.0 headers is right-angled. The audio system features the Realtek ALC 1220 audio chip, with 5 Nichicon Fine Gold series capacitors for filtering. There is also a line around the whole audio system that is designed to prevent any interference from reaching the audio system components. In terms of connectivity, there are plenty of options available. Starting from left to right, we have the BIOS Flashback button, which, as I've said earlier, will allow you to update the BIOS even if you don't have a CPU installed. It is also great for fixing a corrupted BIOS. Next, there are two gold-plated antenna ports for the integrated Wi-Fi network card. There is a single PS2 port that is also a combined port and will accept both a mouse and a keyboard, well, one or the other. Below that you have two standard USB 3.0 ports. Going further to the right, there is a single HDMI port and one Displayport. The lighter blue USB ports are in fact USB 3.1 Gen 2 ports, while below that there are two USB 3.1 Type-C ports. Finally, we have two RJ45 LAN ports and the usual audio jacks with the optical out port. The only thing missing here is a button for resetting the BIOS to the factory settings, but I can't complain about that because that button is located elsewhere on the motherboard, above the power and reset buttons. The BIOS is another thing which you either like it or you don't. Truth be told, I've never had any issues with the ASRock BIOS interface, as it has remained mostly unchanged across the years, with only subtle differences and changes in the way menus work and how the settings have their layout set. The BIOS in the case of the Creator is pretty simple and has no easy mode page at all. This is, after all, a motherboard designed for high workflow and productivity. Nevertheless, the BIOS itself is nice to look at, with an abstract blue background and light grey accents that match the color of the heatsink. There is also no input lag on this BIOS, and that is greatly appreciated. The overall performance of the X570 Creator is very good and will certainly be better with a higher end processor. However, in this review, only a Ryzen 5 3600X CPU was used, paired with a Founders Edition GTX 1070 graphics card. We start our performance testing with GTA 5, a game still popular thanks to its online mode and constant DLC releases. This game is still being used for benchmarks because many missions in its single-player campaign have scripted events which make the whole testing process very easy to replicate and thus get more accurate in the results. In our case, the X570 Creator has an average frame rate of 136 frames per second with rarely any dips, with a minimum frame rate of 90 FPS. The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt is the next game to be tested in our review, and the X570 Creator managed an average frame rate of 97 frames per second, with a minimum frame rate of 69. There were some dips into the frame rate, especially when the game was rendering multiple light sources and objects in the same area. However, the overall gaming experience was smooth. Metro Exodus is next, running at 1080p like the rest of the games, but using the ultra quality preset in DirectX 12 mode with ray tracing disabled. The game has an average frame rate of 64 frames per second with a minimum value of 50 frames per second. There are some dips into the frame rate as this game is heavy on the system in a particular segment of the game, which is known for low performance. Nevertheless, the overall gameplay experience is good, albeit some settings can be tweaked to get even higher frame rates. The final game in our review is Shadow of the Tomb Raider, also running at 1080p with the highest quality preset selected, vertical sync disabled and pure hair turned off. The X570 creator reached an average frame rate of 67 with rarely any dips, and a minimum frame rate of 56 frames per second. Even though this game also has plenty of light sources and foliage to diffuse the light and thus put a harder load on the system, the frame rate remains stable and consistent. The ASRock X570 creator is available for $500 and that is quite a lot to spend on a motherboard. But this particular motherboard is packed full with features that are actually useful. First of all, the VRM system is overbuilt and will handle any CPU at any frequency and voltage that will fit and is compatible with the AM4 socket and the X570 chipset. One of the shortcomings present on this motherboard is also present on most if not all X570 motherboards. It is that small fan that is meant to cool the chipset, and it does that with ease. But the factory fan profile is too aggressive and the fan spins way too fast even when the system is idling. Fortunately, you can fix this yourself in the BIOS of the motherboard or using a software that is capable of controlling the fans.